Morning. What we have here is failure to communicate. Anybody recognize that?
Oh, yeah.
Cool Hand Luke. Happens to be the 40th anniversary this weekend of the release of that movie. It's one of my favorites. What's it a story of? Among other things, it's a story of the problems that occur when you have a warden on a southern chain gang prison having to deal with, let's call it a free spirit. Strother Martin and Paul Newman. It's a story about what happens when you have different perspectives and different attitudes towards life and how that affects their ability to work with one another. And in large measure, that's what we need to do when we communicate with folks. We need to recognize that we all have different attitudes and different perspectives, and those differences can cause problems in how we communicate. And these problems can really come out quite distinctly in situations like we have when we talk about the environment that are very complex, highly technical, include a lot of uncertainty, and that people care very deeply about. My title earlier was Special Assistant to the Director. People often ask me, well, what does that mean? What it means is one of the things that I do is I translate. I'm a translator. I listen to people who are trying to work with one another and say, you know, here's where I think you can find your similarities, and here's what your differences are, and why don't you try to work through those. So that's one of the things I do. What I'd like to do with you today is talk a little bit about some techniques that I use. Hopefully you'll learn some lessons from those and be able to translate them to your own perspectives and attitudes and be more successful in terms of communication. Point number one, you've already heard it. People that share experiences and training are members of a club. But we tend to forget that people that we otherwise work with aren't members of the same club. And so we use technical language, jargon, acronyms, and we think people pick up on those shorthand ways of communicating. They are very effective ways of communicating in shorthand for people that are part of the same club. But if you're not part of that club, they get in the way. The second point is about using a framework that people can relate to when you convey information. Now, one that I use, and it's not going to, people's frameworks are going to be different, but one that I use that I find often successful is to break things that we're talking about down into three categories. And I work in the public policy arena, so this one happens to work for me. Al, Dave, Senator Van Workum, they work in slightly different arenas. They're going to have slightly different frameworks. Okay? But this is one that works for me. First of all, what are the facts? What do we know about the world? What don't we know? How well do we know it? What are the uncertainties? That's one thing we talk about. The second thing we talk about is, what is the law? Who can do what? Who can't do what? What decisions can people make? What factors apply to those decisions? That's another subject area. And finally, what is the policy choice? What are the policy choices? Given the facts and the law, what choices do we have? And what factors apply to those choices? Okay. Now, why is that framework helpful? Why is it helpful to me? One is, it forces me to keep things simple. It forces me to think about, okay, are we talking about facts? Are we talking about legal issues? Or are we talking about policy choices? And if I can put things in those three categories, I can convey them in a way, in language, as you've heard, that people can relate to. And that's really the second major point. It helps me put things in a framework that people can relate to, and it helps me try to convey why things are important to them, why they should care about them. So that's another benefit. A third benefit is that it helps people avoiding discussing apples and oranges. You can't reach agreement if someone's arguing about a fact and someone else is arguing about a policy choice. So you can say, wait a second, do you agree on the facts? Then you can discern if they don't agree, well, what do we need to do to try to resolve the disagreement about the facts? If they agree on the facts, then it is a question about the fact that they evaluate those facts differently. Are they making different policy choices? So you can avoid having people talk about apples and oranges. And finally, and this is important for anyone that wants to acquire change, it helps hold people accountable and responsible. Who has the right or the opportunity to do what? And why are they doing it? So if you want to change something, you can discern whether or not where someone is coming from is based on their belief about a fact, legal requirement, or a policy choice. And once you break those things down into those three categories, you can say, well, if it's a factual dispute, I'm going to bring you some different facts. I'm going to try to change your perception of what the world looks like. If it's their understanding of what they think the law is, then you can say, well, I'm going to try to change the law. Or I'm going to convince you that the law really means something differently than you think it does. And if it's a policy choice, then you have to try to figure out, how can I influence this person to make a different choice? Why are they making the choice that they're making? And what can I do to have them make a different choice? So it helps you decide who is making what decisions and how you can change them. Those points that I just talked about bridging the gap between perceptions and attitudes. Now just some really simple techniques about when you deal with people. We work with people on a very human level. That's how we can be most effective. So just a couple of pointers. Be as informal as you possibly can working with people, appropriate to the situation. Be as personal as you can, appropriate to the situation. Use humor as appropriate to the situation. But be yourself. Don't try to be something you're not, because that makes you uncomfortable. And the people you work with sense that discomfort and they become uncomfortable. And that's an impediment to good communication. And finally, live by the golden rule. Think about, if I were on the other side of this communication, how would I feel about it? How would it affect me? So put yourself in someone else's shoes as much as possible. And that's a good way of trying to figure out, how can I communicate with someone? Thank you.